Assalamu alaikum everyone. Peace and blessings of God be with you all. Bismillah wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. So this is a follow-up to my previous presentation about COVID vaccines. I really like this format. I like the way I'm able to break things down and give it the time that it needs. And I plan on doing future topics, mainly focusing on general health, disease prevention, nutrition, topics I'm really passionate about. But here we're going to talk about certain talking points that are circulating today that are trying to blame the current Delta surge on vaccines. So we're going to address those questions here. So COVID vaccines, friend or foe? Again, my name is Yaman Abdullah. I practice as a hospitalist. I've been taking care of COVID patients, and I'm trained in internal medicine. And someone asked me last time about how am I digesting this information? Am I coming up with everything from scratch? And the truth is no. I'm not a virologist. I'm not an infectious disease specialist. I depend on experts that I refer to. Some of the experts I refer to are Dr. Paul Offit and Dr. Gregory Polland. I think they've been extremely accurate, and they've been the most intellectually honest about vaccines and the pandemic. So those are some of the ones I refer to, but I think I'm good at breaking things down. So my intention here is to use my medical training to try to break complicated concepts down to a simplified manner for the average person to understand. So that's the intention here. I'm not pretending like I'm synthesizing everything from zero and coming up with a new analysis here. All right, and before we get into those talking points about whether the current surge can be blamed on vaccines or not, someone also asked me, do I believe that each and every single person has to be vaccinated? And to cut it short, my general answer is, I believe whoever is eligible for the vaccine should get it. But there are three people I won't argue much with. Right? Number one, if somebody got naturally infected, meaning they tested positive. Not that they had a cold and that they assumed it was COVID without getting tested, but they had symptoms, they tested positive, and they recovered, so they have natural infection. And as a consequence, they have natural immunity. Now, the data that we're seeing from my understanding is that natural immunity is very robust, it's very good, but people who get a natural infection are twice as likely to get reinfected compared to someone who got a natural infection and got vaccinated afterwards. But still, when it comes to severe disease and hospitalization, natural immunity protects very well against that, almost comparable to vaccines. Again, unless I'm missing something. So someone who had a natural infection, I'm not going to argue with. Someone who has a legitimate medical exemption, like a severe allergic reaction, either to vaccines in the past or possible adjuvants in the vaccine, like polyethylene glycol, or someone who's got a history of autoimmune disease, or a very strong family history of autoimmune disease, like Guillain-Barré syndrome, and they've had a doctor or a specialist tell them you shouldn't get vaccinated because the concern is enough to avoid vaccination compared to the risk of getting infected. Now, still, there's a lot of debate on that because the COVID-19 itself, the virus itself, can cause neurological disease, blood clots. A lot of the side effects that we're worried with the vaccine is a much higher risk with the infection itself, right? But if a doctor gives you a legitimate medical exemption, you can't argue with that. And number three, people who are still skeptical, they still don't want to get vaccinated, but they understand the severity of COVID-19 and they take precautions. Right? And I've talked to people like that, like, hey doc, I understand what you're saying. I understand this is extremely serious. I understand even if I'm in a low risk category, I could expose someone else down the chain. I could expose someone else who's in a high risk category that could lead to loss of life. I understand that. So they don't use stupid talking points and conspiracy theory to justify reckless behavior, right? They're still skeptical. They still don't want to take the vaccine, but they understand this is serious. All right, so they wear masks. They avoid indoor gatherings, especially ones with poor ventilation. Right? They avoid traveling, especially to hot spots. They can afford. Some people just can't afford to do that. Obviously, some people have to go out and work and have to go out into the world, have to travel. but some people's lifestyles can accommodate for not doing any of that and being super cautious. Okay, I'm not going to argue with you there. But one thing we have to understand for people who think, well, okay, if you're vaccinated and I'm not, you're protected. So, why are you worried about me not being vaccinated? Because there are people we have to, there's a part of our population that we have to advocate for that depend on the herd. They depend on herd immunity, on everyone else getting vaccinated around them. Because even if they get vaccinated, they're still in danger. They're still at risk. And that's mainly the elderly, because as we age, our immune system isn't so strong. So even the elderly, if they get vaccinated, and what does elderly mean? From what I've seen as far as breakthrough infections leading to hospitalization and possibly death even in the vaccinated, even though that's a fraction compared to the unvaccinated. But mainly the elderly, mainly 70 years or above, especially with other major medical conditions. Even if they're vaccinated, their immune response to the vaccine is not as robust as a younger person. So even if they get exposed after getting vaccinated, they can still develop severe disease and be hospitalized. People who are immunosuppressant medications, like people who got organ transplant or bone marrow transplant, people who have autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis or multiple sclerosis, people with cancer who are getting chemotherapy, they're on medications that are suppressing their immune system. So even if they get vaccinated, they're unable to produce a robust immune response in response to the vaccine itself. And unfortunately, we have many cases in the bigger hospitals of, especially like transplant patients who are fully vaccinated, but they're coming in with severe disease in the ICU, and their blood work are basically showing barely any detectable antibodies against COVID, even though they were fully vaccinated. That's because they are unable to mount a full immune response. And lastly, children who aren't able to get vaccinated, even though the death rate, the infection fatality rate is not very high in children, there are still, like the last data I've seen was out of 4 million infections, 400 children died, right? Which doesn't seem like a lot. But especially with this Delta variant, we're seeing a surge in hospitalizations for children as well, and children can get vaccinated if they're under 12 years old. So there are still people we have to think about. It's not just a matter of everyone for themselves and let everyone decide for themselves. Our personal decisions affect people around us, and if it affects society at large. Okay, so this is a graphic that's been going around that's been scaring the heck out of people. Right, and I want you to pay attention to what this is intended to do. So, this is basically showing, hey, vaccines were introduced at this red marker here. Let me see if I can pull up a laser feature. So vaccines were introduced, and we see these mutations happening, and these mutations, coming along after mass vaccination started, because there's a lot of conspiracy theory and a lot of talking points that are basically trying to blame the current surge on vaccines, because there are these theories that vaccines can accelerate the pandemic and worsen the pandemic. How? By this process of selective pressure, where they select for more dangerous variants. It's kind of like a survival of the fittest type of thing on a microscopic scale, that you wipe out all the weak versions and only the strong versions remain and take over, right? And they use fancy terms like antibody-dependent enhancement, ADE, which we'll talk about, selective pressure, right? And so if you've seen my last presentation, one underlying principle we always have to apply whenever it comes to science and statistics is correlation does not always equal causation. Just because something correlates with an event, something correlates with another, doesn't mean that it caused it. But here, this is designed to appeal to the emotions of someone who doesn't know any better, and I consider myself someone who knows better, and this still instills anxiety in me, right? Like, I feel anxious looking at this, so I can't imagine someone who's not literate in science or in how to interpret scientific data, right? This is designed to scare people, and so I don't blame people for being scared because of this. But let's break this down a little further. Now, there was this study from the University of Maryland full vaccination is imperative to suppress SARS-CoV-2 Delta variant mutation frequency. This is basically showing that countries with low vaccination rates had the highest mutation frequencies. They had the highest mutation rates. So this virus is mutating where people aren't vaccinated. And this makes sense biologically, right? When a virus infects you, it hijacks your cellular machinery, like we described last time, to clone itself millions of times over. So a single infected person can produce up to 1 billion copies of a virus. And in that cloning process, there's going to be slight alterations in the virus. So it makes sense. I mean, if each person can produce up to 1 billion copies of a virus, then when the virus runs rampant through an unvaccinated population, that's when the mutations are going to happen, right? That's not to dismiss things like vaccine resistance or vaccine failure or immune escape due to vaccines. These are observed phenomenon that we'll get into. But from the data that we're seeing, mutations are happening in countries that are the least vaccinated. Like India is where the Delta variant was first identified in October 2020, before mass vaccination even started, right? And back in March or in April, when the fatalities were really starting to surge in India, the population was less than 2% vaccinated, right? So this idea that vaccines are the ones causing this emergence of these dangerous variants it's absurd, right? It's completely false. So here we see on the y-axis mutation frequency, and then on the x-axis fully vaccinated rates. So the lower the vaccinated rates, the higher the frequency of mutations. The higher the vaccination rates in a country, the lower the mutational frequency. So this is to play the correlation game on the flip side, right? So here we see, vaccinations in Texas, because Texas is being it's being overwhelmed by this Delta surge right now, and our hospitals are being strained. So we see that vaccinations are going up and up, and they peak mid-April, but then they start downtrending. People stop getting vaccinated, and they nadir mid-July. We have this decrease in July. And the Delta surge in August happens corresponding with a low vaccination rate. So when vaccination rates drop is when surges happen. Right, that's basically what we're seeing. And when we refer to with the Delta variant, our definitions have had to change because the Delta variant is a lot more contagious. So we're seeing even in highly vaccinated communities, there could be outbreaks of cases, right, of symptomatic cases. So a lot of people getting mild to moderate COVID infections, which would make like cold-like symptoms, but it still protects against severe disease. And this is one severe disease leading to hospitalization and death. And that's when we talk about sterilizing immunity versus functional immunity. In the beginning with the trials, we were seeing sterilizing immunity. We'll get into these definitions a little later. But basically, the vaccines were decreasing infections completely. It was decreasing symptomatic cases completely, and it was protecting incredibly against severe disease and hospitalization. But the Delta variant threw a wrench into that. Now we're seeing that it's more contagious. It can hide out a little better in the sinuses because it's a mucosal infection. So it could avoid vaccine immunity a little bit by hiding in the sinuses. But once it tries to disseminate and spread in a vaccinated individual or even someone who's had a natural infection, we see that immunity immediately kicks in and prevents severe disease, right? So before the Delta variant, sterilizing immunity was very strong. With the Delta variant now, we're not seeing sterilizing immunity, but we're still seeing functional immunity, protecting against severe disease, hospitalization, and death. And really, that's from what I understand from the experts, that's our current expectation of the vaccines as far as them doing their job incredibly well. So here we see the surge starts when vaccine rates drop. So we can make the same argument in terms of correlation and causation that, hey, when vaccines rate drop is when the surges happen. The surges that are mainly causing severe disease, hospitalization, and death. And again, this is also the case for, I think this is from Florida, actually. The blue line represents cases and the red line represents vaccination rates. Again, as vaccination rates drop is when you get the surge in COVID cases. One caveat I have to mention, I said even though the Delta variant was causing more cases, more symptomatic cases, even in highly vaccinated communities, it's still the rate of symptomatic cases is still much lower compared to the unvaccinated, right? And they're also studying what's contributing to the outbreaks of symptomatic cases. It could be waning immunity, which we'll talk about, where over time the immune system, even in response to vaccines, can weaken a little bit and wane. It can decline a little bit, but we'll talk more about that later. But again, correlation. I could easily make the same argument. Correlating with lower vaccination rates is when leading it to the surge. And we all saw this outbreak in Cape Cod. I think it was in Provincetown. We saw an outbreak of a couple of hundred cases in one of the most highly vaccinated communities in the country. So the headlines were going crazy. We're like, are these vaccines even working? What's the point of this? Do we even need to vaccinate? What people need to understand with this Delta variant, again, our expectation now is functional immunity protecting against severe disease, hospitalization, and death, right? Because we have a much more contagious variant now that can cause more viral shedding, and it can hide out in the mucosa, because it's a mucosal virus. It can hide in our mucosa a lot better than before, a lot better compared to previous variants. So what we see here is that among people with breakthrough infections, right, 4 of them, or 1.2%, were hospitalized and no deaths occurred, right? So this should be a success story for vaccines. But the way it's spun, because of, unfortunately, there's been a lot of terrible messaging around this, even from the medical establishment, from the CDC, unfortunately. Like, they've gotten a lot of things right, but a lot of times, they don't get things right. And this was twisted to mean that vaccination is useless, when this was actually a success story for vaccines. So are vaccines making things worse? And what are some talking points that people use to try to make that case? Antibody-dependent enhancement, ADE, which we'll get into. Selective pressure for more dangerous variants, this survival of the fittest. And waning immunity, declining immunity, vaccines stopping to work. So let's get into this. Oh my goodness, we're already at 18 minutes. All right, we'll try to... Sorry, I give up on timing myself and being concise. We're just gonna work through this and make sure it's done properly. All right, so antibody-dependent enhancement. So ADE, what is it exactly? This is a phenomenon we've seen before. This is not anything new. This is something that the medical establishment and the scientific community knows very well of. It's something we know to keep an eye out for in clinical trials. So this is something that dates back 30, 40 years, right? I believe in the 70s, when they were trying to make vaccines against the dengue virus. Dengue virus is on the rise. It's one of the most common mosquito-borne illnesses, and it causes hemorrhagic fever. It's a very nasty virus. So basically what happens in both natural infection and vaccine immunity when in the dengue virus, again, this is not exclusive to vaccines. This happens in natural infections too. With the dengue virus, what they noticed was someone could get a natural infection from dengue virus, recover, and then when they get exposed again, they get sicker. They get more severe disease. And they noticed that in the vaccine too. We vaccinate people against dengue fever. Then they get exposed to the dengue virus and they get sicker. They get more severe disease. What's happening here? This is antibody-dependent enhancement. The virus is depending on antibodies to enhance the disease. All right? How does this happen? Again, this happens in both natural infection and vaccine immunity. So when it comes to antibodies, you have neutralizing antibodies and non-neutralizing antibodies, or binding antibodies. Neutralizing antibodies, they coat the virus and they incapacitate the virus. The virus can't do anything, right? They wrestle the virus and the virus gives up. It's unable to infect any cell. It's unable to replicate itself. It's unable to do anything. It's useless. And we have organs that specialize in immunity, like our spleen, who see that, and they flush that out, and we excrete it. So those are neutralizing antibodies. They incapacitate the virus. They knock the virus out. The virus can't do anything. One really good example of that is measles, the measles vaccine. Neutralizing antibodies, you would never even think that you were exposed to measles because of how good they are. The measles just bounces right off of you. Those are neutralizing antibodies, but ADE depends on non-neutralizing antibodies, antibodies that attach to the virus, but they don't quite neutralize it. They don't knock it out. Instead, what they do is they flag other immune cells to, hey, come here, you check this out. Like macrophages, for example, they come and they swallow this flagged virus, and the virus, like a Trojan horse, uses the macrophage to clone itself and propagate itself, and it worsens disease. So that can happen in natural infection or in vaccination for dengue virus. In RSV, respiratory syncytial virus, which affects kids, a couple of decades ago, they also tried to do vaccines against it, and they noticed this phenomenon that the antibodies that were being produced were not neutralizing the virus. They were binding to the virus, but they were non-neutralizing antibodies. So the virus would, all the antibodies would attach to the virus particles, and the virus turns into this like transformer that starts to trigger all this worse inflammation, and it can even cause obstruction in the lungs and cause enhanced respiratory disease, ERD. It could worsen respiratory disease. RSV causes respiratory disease already, but it can worsen it, and that's what they saw with RSV of the past, and that's why those vaccines failed. So that's what ADE is. So if ADE was happening with the COVID vaccines, what we would be seeing is that this would be a pandemic of the vaccinated. We would see vaccinated people getting sicker and sicker, and they would be the ones filling up the hospitals. But that's not what we're seeing, right? What we're seeing is incredible protection against severe disease and hospitalization and death, which we would not see if ADE was a thing. And I used this last time as well. Right, in 60% plus vaccination in communities with 60% plus vaccination, infections, hospitalizations, and deaths drastically low compared to the unvaccinated or communities that were lower vaccinated. Now again, pointing to waning immunity and how infections can still happen in the vaccinated population. Here we do see an uptick here starting August, right, in infections, and we'll talk about that. But again, nothing compared to the lower vaccinated and the unvaccinated. So this is to point out that ADE was always on the radar. It's something we already know to look for in clinical trials. It's something already on the radar of the scientific community when they're doing these vaccines, of the ones who are running the clinical trials when they're testing it on people. They're looking for, are vaccinated people getting enhanced respiratory disease? Right? Are they getting worse disease after getting vaccinated? So it's saying, this has been observed in the past, and this is something we have to look out for, and this is very legitimate. A lot of conspiracy theorists try to paint this picture like, no one wants you to know about ADE. The establishment is hiding this. This is something we've discovered and we're going to expose. No, this has been on the radar. This is known already. This is a known phenomenon, and a lot of these people, they depend on the same system. Where this was published in what's the date on this? Yeah, in September 2020. So a lot of people, they depend on the same system that makes all this public and makes all this very well known. They depend on the same system to then demonize it. Right? It just doesn't make any sense to me. And here also it says ERD, enhanced respiratory disease with vaccination. It should be observed in the phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials. And we talked about, the phases of the clinical trials in the last presentation. So they said ADE is a concern. if it's truly happening, we'll see it in the clinical trials, right? And if you go to the clinical trials, we did not see that. And this is to debunk another myth that, somehow the vaccines caused the Delta variant. The Delta variant was discovered in India, right, back in October 2020 in the state of Maharashtra. So this was discovered way before mass vaccination even began, right? And I even had somebody say, well, maybe it was from the clinical trials. The clinical trials showed sterilizing immunity. If anything, it would come from the placebo trials where there were more cases and more chances for the vaccine, the virus to propagate itself. Because remember, each infected individual can produce up to 1 billion viral particles. Right? Whatever. All right, and this basically shows a vaccine trial of efficacy. We had the Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, Moderna. Efficacy in preventing clinical COVID, which is just symptomatic COVID, which could be just ranging from a mild cold, right, to a worse cold, to severe disease, pneumonia, ARDS, acute respiratory distress syndrome. So clinical COVID, actually they make a distinction here between clinical COVID and severe COVID, right? Severe COVID is what would land you in the hospital and cause death. So, preventing clinical COVID is what we call sterilizing immunity, no symptomatic cases. Preventing severe COVID is what we call more functional immunity, non-sterilizing immunity. So this was based on pre-existing variants before. The numbers were incredible, right? These were the numbers that were initially reported. Johnson & Johnson, 66% against symptomatic cases, but 85% against severe COVID. Pfizer, 95% against symptomatic cases, 90% against severe. Moderna, 94% and 100%. All right, and then they studied, people who got these vaccines, and then they studied other variants, right? And they basically said that, well, we see a decrease in neutralizing antibodies when it comes to these other variants. All right, so a lot of times what we see in the lab, what we see growing in these assays, what we see from lab studies, we might see a decrease in neutralizing antibodies. Should we panic then if these other variants are coming along and these vaccines aren't covering the variants like they did in the clinical trials before these variants emerged? Then should we panic? Does that mean the vaccines are failing? Right? And that's when we see the numbers when it comes to efficacy, preventing clinical infection or preventing severe disease, they start to wane a little bit. In a couple of countries, like the UK, for example, Israel, South Africa, they're saying, well, maybe there's a decrease in efficacy, because of waning immunity or because these variants are avoiding the immune system. So what does that mean clinically? That's the next question. We have this data from the lab. What does that translate to in the real world? What does that translate to clinically? What do we see on the ground? So we see that, antibody persistence through 6 months after the second dose. We see this concept of waning immunity, declining immunity. Antibodies no longer to work against the COVID variants like before. It goes down a little bit, right? According to these laboratory studies over time. This was like over 6 months. We see a little bit of waning immunity as far as using, ELISA here is basically, ELISA measures antibody levels against the receptor binding domain, the RBD, on the spike protein of the virus, the antibodies binding to the virus. So the antibodies start to wane a little bit at the 6 month point. Neutralization assays, neutralizing antibodies start to wane a little bit. So that's why there's all this talk about booster shots now. Is that really necessary to give a boost to the immunity if after 6 months or so we're starting to see waning immunity that can especially affect the elderly and those with major comorbidities and those who are higher at risk. But what we also see, so this is a good time to talk about the immune system. We have B cell immunity, which produce antibodies, the B in antibody, remember, is linked to B cells. And I have a graphic later explaining this. Then there's also the other wing of the immune system is T cell immunity. So T cells are different. T cells don't make antibodies, but they directly attack infected cells. What they show here is that T cell immunity is actually remarkably good, even 6 months out. So that's why measuring antibodies sometimes can be useless, because antibodies by themselves, they don't give the whole picture. Antibodies come from B cells, but there's also a whole other wing of the immune system we're ignoring, which is T cell immunity, which can directly attack infected cells. So 6 months out, the level, this study showing the levels stay very, very stable, compared to antibody levels that can wane. But one other thing to remember is antibodies also protect against mucosal infections, because there's an antibody called IgA, which protects against mucosal infections. So maybe as the antibody levels wane, these variants are able to hide out in the mucosa, in the sinuses, a little better, right? But when they try to spread and cause, so they could cause mild infections. But when they spread to the rest of the body and try to cause severe disease, we still see this far out, we still see tremendous protection against severe disease, hospitalization, and death. So this is just a good summary of the immune system and how it works. So first you have, I did like a military example here, where the B cells on the right are kind of like the Air Force. Like antibodies are like missiles. And then the T cells are like the army. They're like the foot soldiers, right? So the Air Force can bombard, but the army can go in and directly attack as well, right? And so that's why our immune system is very sophisticated. And on top here, the APCs, the antigen presenting cells, are the scouts. They go out and they scout, and then they report to the Air Force and the Army. So you have like macrophages and dendritic cells that are APCs, antigen presenting cells. So they're the ones that scout out the viruses and the pathogens, and then recruit the B cells and the T cells. All right, so this is kind of like one of the predictive models. So what could possibly happen with waning immunity? Where the strategy would be, initially you would mass vaccinate to build immunity quickly, right? And then if you see immunity waning, then you would do booster shots to rebuild immunity, right? Especially in the high risk category, again, elderly or major comorbidities. And then, as the variants evolve, you would refocus to the specific variants. All right, and that's what we have with vaccine technology. As variants emerge, they could target the variants, but that takes time, right? And this model of waning immunity, it's not special for COVID, right? This is like, does this mean that the vaccines aren't working? Is this some new phenomenon that we need to freak out about? No. Like, we know this happens with the flu every single year. This happens with the common cold. This happens with chickenpox, right? You can have a chickenpox vaccine, and as a person ages, even though they're vaccinated against chickenpox, later in life they could get shingles, right? Which is the same herpes virus that causes shingles in adults, in the elderly mainly, because you have waning immunity as time goes by. So waning immunity, declining immunity despite getting vaccinated, right? This is a known thing, right? So this is something that's been on the radar as well. And that's why we're talking about the need for booster shots, potentially with these new variants that can affect the most vulnerable amongst us. I think I put this here again to highlight again how infections were on the uptrend despite being fully vaccinated in the communities, but this would have been manageable, right? If we had if mass vaccination truly was successful and we got to the goal of mass vaccination, to at least 60–70%, this would have been manageable, even despite a more contagious variant. But we kind of collectively as a society, we shot ourselves in the foot by refusing to get vaccinated and allow ourselves to fall for propaganda and just be reckless, right? So This is really what's straining the hospitals. It's what's causing no, hospitalizations. Yep. So this is the pandemic now that's affecting the unvaccinated. This is really what's straining our hospitals. This is what's causing a compounded catastrophe, because now non-COVID, people with non-COVID disease, non-COVID cases get compromised, and deaths can happen now for conditions not related to COVID, but just because the hospitals are so strained that they can't take care of non-COVID cases anymore as well. And I remember the people that rely on herd immunity, the elderly, the people on immunosuppressant medications, or with compromised immune systems, children, they're collateral damage, because despite getting vaccinated, or children who are unable to get vaccinated, this outbreak in the unvaccinated exposes them and affects them. So there are people being hospitalized and dying despite being vaccinated because of this outbreak in the unvaccinated. So again, if we had mass vaccination reach the target, then a more contagious variant would have been easier to deal with. And basically, this article highlights how the emergence of variants, vaccine, it could be held at bay with mass vaccination, but sometimes if a virus is allowed to just rip through even a vaccinated population, if we vaccinate people but we don't control transmission, like in something like the Delta variant, which we see is more transmissible, then we could still get viruses that can escape, that can avoid vaccine immunity even better. They can train themselves against the vaccine even better. So this is saying that we shouldn't just 100% rely on vaccines in the case of Delta. We should also do other interventions, especially wearing masks when community transmission is high. So again, the Delta variant did change the game a bit with in terms of how transmissible and how contagious it can be even in a vaccinated community. So this is highlighting how we should still do other measures. So there's science behind this. It's not like when the CDC recommends wearing masks even for vaccinated people, oh, that's it, that means vaccines don't work, vaccines don't help, right? No, this means that we still have to be cautious. Viruses are extremely adaptive. If we just ignore transmission through even a vaccinated community, it's possible that there could be a strain that becomes more resistant to the vaccines. Even though the more you vaccinate, the lower the mutational rate, but still there are variants that can come out that can be more contagious and can effectively avoid immunity, even if it's temporarily. All right, sorry, the video cut up a bit. Okay, so 38 minutes. Sorry, epic fail again with trying to keep this short. But lastly, I wanted to conclude with this. This is an amazing article. I recommend everyone read this. Look up this article. Google this headline. It's Quantum Magazine, and shout out to Rebecca Foster for sending this to me. The headline sounds kind of like, is this some anti-vaxxer stuff? That's what I was expecting, but it's one of the most scientific articles I've ever read. It's excellent, and I think it's from a couple of years ago, and it basically gives the reality about vaccines. Vaccines are, in some cases, they give sterilizing immunity, like in the case of measles, for example, many other diseases. But in the case of measles, sterilizing immunity, right? Complete removal, complete incapacitation and knockout of the virus. But in other cases, it doesn't knock it out, right? And there are viruses and bacteria so the article goes through examples of viruses and bacteria historically that have evaded vaccine immunity, that learned how to evade and avoid vaccine immunity, right? Like in the farming industry, viruses that affect chickens, for example, or even pertussis that affects kids, or pneumococcus bacteria that causes pneumonia, strep pneumonia. The bacteria is called streptococcus pneumonia, or pneumococcus, where it's more, instead of sterilizing, instead of a KO, it's more of a never-ending warfare. where the vaccines have to evolve and have to and the science of vaccines have to evolve. So vaccines are pushing pathogens to evolve. There's truth to that, and he goes through examples. But the article is actually very pro-vaccine. Right? So people can get the impression that this is like some crazy article, some crazy anti-vaxxer article. It's an excellent article that gives the true representation of what's happening with vaccines. Okay, so this graphic basically summarizes, based on the article, how vaccines can lose their effectiveness over time. Mainly focuses on natural evolution just by random mutations, where over time a vaccine is targeted to a specific antigen, but over time with random mutations and different antigens coming up as a result of those mutations, vaccines can lose their effectiveness. And then there's vaccine-driven evolution, where multiple vaccinations targeted against one antigen can select for different antigens that become part of the more dominant strain. Slight difference, but it tells the truth about vaccine resistance is a thing. Vaccine failure can happen. It's very rare out of all the pathogens we produce vaccines against, but it is a real thing, and it's part of vaccine science. So and this is something that virologists and vaccinologists, they look out for, and they're very well aware of. So in cases like pertussis and pneumococcus, and even cases of hepatitis B, also evading vaccine immunity, right? What they're finding is the vaccine, that they're able to evolve in response to the evolution of the virus. So the vaccines are able to adapt and evolve. And for example, they're coming out with better ways, more targeted approaches than the vaccines. Instead of maybe targeting one protein on the virus, to target multiple parts of the virus at once, right? So the virus doesn't have this chance to just say, okay, they're only targeting one part of me, so this is going to be easy to adapt to just overwhelm the virus and not allow it to go through that process. So it's an excellent article. I advise everyone to read it. 42 minutes. I'm very sorry, y'all. But whoever listened through that again, or listened through the whole thing, I really appreciate it. And inshallah, the next videos I do, where it's going to focus more on disease prevention, I think I could be a bit more concise with that, but no promises. I've failed on that so far. So until next time, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace and blessings of God be with you all.